On a blood-soaked afternoon in the Arizona Territory, a widowed schoolteacher fleeing her past stumbles upon a wounded Apache warrior bleeding out in bandit-infested canyon country. With nothing but her wits and a broken-down wagon between them and certain death, she makes a choice that defies every survival instinct, dragging this stranger through 20 miles of the most dangerous land in the West. What she doesn't know is that the man she's saving isn't just any warrior. And when dawn breaks and he reveals his true identity, her act of desperate compassion will shatter everything she thought she knew about power, mercy, and the invisible lines that divide enemies from saviors. The sun hammered down on the Arizona desert like the fist of an angry god, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Julia Sinclair sat hunched on the driver's bench of her listing wagon. The reins slack in her blistered hands as her single remaining mule, a stubborn gray beast named Chester, plodded forward with the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own hanging. 26 years old, and Julia looked like she'd lived twice that. Her dark blonde hair, once pinned neat and proper, now hung in sweat-dampened strands across her sunburned face. Her traveling dress, modest gray cotton that had been her best when she left Santa Fe 3 weeks ago, was now stained with dust and salt and the particular kind of exhaustion that seeps into fabric and won't wash out. She was 3 days past Fort Bowie, heading toward Tucson with nothing but $12 in a leather pouch, a trunk of books she couldn't bear to leave behind, and the desperate hope that a town she'd never seen might offer her something Santa Fe no longer could. A fresh start, anonymity, distance from the whispers that had followed her like hungry dogs after her husband's death. Thomas Sinclair had been a gambler, a charmer, a man who could make you believe the sun rose just to hear him speak. He'd also been a thief. And when the men he'd stolen from caught up to him in an alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, they'd made sure his death was slow enough to serve as a lesson. Julia had found him the next morning, and with him she'd found the truth about the man she'd married, the debts, the lies, the enemies who now looked at her with eyes that asked how much she'd known. So she'd packed what little she owned, sold what she could, and run. Not in panic, but with the cold calculation of someone who understood that staying meant becoming collateral. Damage in a war she'd never signed up for. The wagon hit a rut and lurched violently, nearly throwing Julia from her seat. She grabbed the rail with one hand and cursed with a fluency that would have shocked the children she'd once taught in Santa Fe's schoolhouse. Chester brayed his own complaint but kept moving, too tired to stop. Too stupid to realize stopping might actually be the smarter choice. They were in the Dragoon Mountains now, following a trader's route that wound through canyons, painted in shades of red and orange and the particular brown that comes from rock baked under centuries of unforgiving sun. It was beautiful in the way a rattlesnake is beautiful. Something to admire from a very safe distance. Julia had been warned about this stretch. The supply merchant in Fort Bowie had looked at her like she was proposing to walk into a burning building. "Ma'am, that route runs straight through Bandit country," he'd said, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. "The Clanton Gang uses those canyons, and they don't take kindly to travelers, especially not women traveling alone." But the alternative route added 8 days to her journey. 8 days of supplies she couldn't afford. 8 more days of exposure to anyone from Santa Fe who might come looking, so she'd thanked him for his concern. Bought an extra canteen and a small revolver she barely knew how to use, and headed into the Dragoons anyway. That had been 2 days ago. And so far the only things she'd encountered were heat, dust, and a family of javelinas who'd watched her pass with the disinterested contempt of creatures who knew they were better adapted to this hell than she'd ever be. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western ridges when Julia first smelled the smoke. Not cookfire smoke, which had a comfortable domestic quality, but something sharper, more acrid, the smell of things that shouldn't be burning. Leather, fabric, flesh. She pulled Chester to a halt. Her heart suddenly loud in her ears. Ahead the canyon narrowed, the walls closing in like a stone vice. And there, perhaps 100 yards distant, she could see the wreckage, 2 wagons, or what was left of them, lay scattered across the canyon floor like broken toys. Their contents spilled and trampled, crates smashed open, barrels staved in, fabric torn and scattered across the rocks. The horses were gone, taken or fled, and the bodies. Julia's stomach clenched. There were 3 of them that she could see. Men in the rough clothes of teamsters, lying in positions that suggested they'd died badly. She should turn around. She knew that with the crystalline clarity that comes from genuine fear. Whatever had happened here was recent, the smoke still rising. And the people who'd done this might still be close. But Tucson was ahead. And turning back meant Fort Bowie and questions she couldn't answer. Meant exposure, meant risk of a different kind. So she clicked her tongue at Chester and urged him forward, keeping to the far side of the canyon. Her hand resting on the revolver in her lap, even though she knew it offered about as much real protection as a harsh word. She was nearly past the wreckage when she heard it. A sound so quiet, she almost missed it beneath the creak of her wagon and the scrape of Chester's hooves. A groan, low and pain-filled, coming from behind an overturned wagon on her right. Julia's first instinct was to keep moving. Whatever was behind that wagon was none of her business. She'd seen enough death in Santa Fe to last a lifetime. Enough violence to understand that mercy and survival rarely occupied the same space. But the sound came again, weaker this time. And Julia found herself pulling Chester to a stop. Found herself climbing down from the wagon, despite every rational thought screaming at her to leave. Found herself walking toward that overturned wagon with her revolver drawn and her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted out. He was lying in the shadow of the wagon, half covered by a torn canvas tarp that might have saved his life by making him less visible to whoever had attacked the caravan. He was Apache, that was immediately clear from his clothing. The traditional buckskin and the beadwork that marked him as someone of status. His long black hair was loose and matted with blood. And his left side was a mess of torn fabric and flesh where a bullet or blade had opened him from ribs to hip. His eyes opened as Julia approached, dark and fever-bright, tracking her with the focused intensity of a predator who hadn't quite decided if he was looking at threat or prey. His right hand moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt. But the motion was weak, barely completed before his arm fell back. "Easy," Julia heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not going to hurt you." The man's lips moved, saying something in Apache she couldn't understand. Then switching to rough Spanish, "Leave me," he managed, his voice like gravel scraping across stone. "Not safe, they come back." Julia glanced around the canyon, seeing nothing but rock and shadow and the smoke still rising from the wreckage. "Who comes back?" she asked, kneeling beside him despite knowing she shouldn't. Despite understanding that every second she stayed here increased her danger exponentially. "Clanton's men," the Apache warrior said, his breath coming in short gasps. "They hunt, they kill, they take. You should not be here, white woman. This is not your fight." He was right, of course. Julia knew that with perfect clarity. This man was a stranger. An Apache warrior in a territory where the wars between settlers and tribes had left wounds, too fresh to even think about healing. Helping him would mark her as a traitor to some, a fool to others, and in practical terms, it would slow her down. Use her precious supplies, and increase her risk of encountering Clanton's gang when they returned. But Julia looked at his face, really looked at it, and saw past the blood and the traditional dress and the cultural divide that was supposed to matter. She saw a man dying alone in the dirt. Saw the same kind of desperate calculation in his eyes that she'd felt in her own chest when she'd fled Santa Fe. The understanding that sometimes the world offers you nothing but bad choices, and you have to pick the one you can live with. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory, from one of his better days before she'd learned what he really was. You know what your problem is, Julia. You think everybody deserves saving. Someday that's going to get you killed. Maybe, Julia thought, but not today. She holstered her revolver and reached for the warrior's arm. "Can you stand?" she asked. Already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. "No," he admitted. And something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. "Too much blood. Too much pain. I am Kasai, of the Chiricahua. I have fought many battles. This is where I die." "Not if I can help it," Julia said, and before she could second-guess herself, before rational thought could reassert control, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and began to drag. Kasai was not a small man. He stood well over 6 feet and carried the lean muscle of someone who'd spent his life on horseback and on foot across terrain that killed weaker men. Dragging him across the rocky ground toward her wagon took everything Julia had. Her back screamed, her arms trembled. Her legs threatened to buckle with each step. She fell twice, once landing hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. But each time she got back up, adjusted her grip, and kept pulling. Kasai had lost consciousness by the time she reached the wagon, which Julia decided was a mercy. At least he wouldn't feel it when she had to lift him into the bed. Getting him up and into the wagon took 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. Julia used crates and rope and leverage and every bit of stubborn determination that had gotten her through the last 6 months. By the time Kasai was finally lying in the wagon bed, covered with the cleanest blanket she had, Julia was shaking with exhaustion and her dress was soaked with a mixture of her sweat and his blood. She climbed back onto the driver's bench, picked up the reins, and urged Chester forward. The mule, sensing her urgency, actually broke into something approaching a trot. They left the massacre site behind, following the canyon as it wound deeper into the dragoons, and Julia didn't look back. The sun was touching the western peaks when Julia found the place she'd been hoping for. A narrow side canyon that split off from the main route, barely wide enough for her wagon, with an overhang of rock that would hide them from casual observation. She guided Chester into it, found a relatively flat spot, and finally allowed herself to stop. Her hands were shaking as she climbed down. Her legs barely holding her weight, she tied Chester to a scrub oak, gave him the last of the grain she could spare, and then turned her attention to the man bleeding in her wagon. Kasai's breathing was shallow but steady, his face pale beneath the bronze of his skin. Julia had no medical training beyond the basic frontier knowledge any woman needed to survive. How to set a bone, how to stitch a wound, how to recognize when someone was too far gone to save. She pulled away the blanket and examined the wound properly for the first time. It was bad, deep and ragged, but the bleeding had slowed to a seep. The blade or bullet had missed anything immediately vital, which meant if she could keep infection away and get fluids into him, he might actually survive. Julia spent the next hour working by the fading light, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made Kasai groan even in unconsciousness, stitching it closed with thread from her sewing kit and a needle sterilized in the flames of her small camp stove, bandaging it with strips torn from her spare petticoat. By the time she finished, full darkness had fallen and she was too exhausted to even think about eating. She made a small fire, screened by rocks so it wouldn't be visible from the main canyon, and sat beside it with her revolver in her lap and her ears straining for any sound that might indicate danger. Kasai lay in the wagon, silent except for his breathing, and the night settled around them heavy with the weight of choices made and consequences yet to come. Julia must have dozed because she woke with a start to find the fire burned down to embers and the moon high overhead. Something had woken her, a sound, a presence. She grabbed her revolver and turned to find Kasai's eyes open, watching her with an intensity that sent ice down her spine. "You should have left me," he said, his voice stronger than before, but still rough with pain. What you have done will bring you trouble." "I've already got trouble," Julia replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "One more piece won't make much difference." Kasai studied her for a long moment, then slowly, carefully. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out something that gleamed in the moonlight. A medallion, silver and intricately carved. Hanging from a leather cord, he held it out to her. "Take this," he said, "when we reach safety. When I am strong enough, you will understand what it means. You will understand who you have saved." Julia took the medallion, feeling its unexpected weight. In the moonlight, she could just make out symbols carved into its surface. Apache symbols she couldn't read, and around the edge, something else. Letters or numbers too small to see clearly. "Who are you?" Julia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Rest," Kasai said, his eyes already closing. "Tomorrow we move, tomorrow. If we survive, you will have your answer." And with that cryptic promise hanging in the air between them, he slipped back into sleep, leaving Julia alone with her questions, her fears, and the growing certainty that her act of mercy had just entangled her in something far larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue. She looked down at the medallion in her hand, turned it over, and in doing so caught the edge where the moonlight hit it just right. There, engraved in tiny letters along the rim, were words in English, words that made her breath catch, words that made her realize that the man bleeding in her wagon was not just any Apache warrior, but she would have to wait until morning to confirm what those words meant, to understand what she'd really done for now. She slipped the medallion into her pocket, added wood to the fire, and settled in to keep watch over a stranger who might be her salvation or her doom. The night stretched ahead, full of shadows and uncertainty, and somewhere in the darkness, men with violence in their hearts were searching. While Julia Sinclair, widow and fugitive, sat beside her fire and wondered if mercy was a virtue or just another word for the kind of foolishness that gets good people killed. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains like a knife cutting through silk, the sky shifting from black to deep purple to a pale gold that promised another day of merciless heat. Julia woke stiff and aching, her back pressed against the wagon wheel, her hand still gripped around the revolver that had become an extension of her body. The fire had died to ash sometime in the small hours, and the cold that settled into desert canyons at night had worked its way into her bones. She stretched slowly, listening to her joints protest, and turned to check on her patient. Kasai was awake, propped up slightly against the side of the wagon bed, his dark eyes tracking her movements with an alertness that hadn't been there the night before. The fever flush had faded from his cheeks, and though pain still etched lines around his mouth, there was a clarity to his gaze that told Julia he'd turned a corner. "You need water," Julia said, reaching for one of her canteens. It was a statement, not a question, and Kasai nodded once in acknowledgement. She helped him drink, supporting his head as he took careful sips, mindful not to let him take too much too fast when he'd had enough. He pushed the canteen away gently and fixed her with a look that carried weight. "The medallion," he said, his voice still rough but stronger. "You looked at it." Julia pulled the silver disc from her pocket, turning it over in the morning light. Now she could see clearly what the darkness had only hinted at. The Apache symbols on one side were intricate, clearly the work of a master craftsman. But it was the English words engraved on the edge that had stolen her sleep. Major General Oliver Howard, Department of Arizona, 1872. "You know this name," Kasai said, watching her face. Julia nodded slowly. Everyone in the territory knew that name. General Howard had been instrumental in negotiating peace treaties with various Apache bands. He was one of the few military officers who'd earned something approaching respect from both sides. "This is his medallion," she said, "which means you're not just any warrior. I am Kasai, war chief of the Chiricahua band." "Nephew to Cochise," he said simply, and the words fell into the canyon morning like stones into still water, each one sending ripples that changed everything. Julia's hand tightened around the medallion. Cochise had been the most formidable Apache leader in the territory's history. His name alone carried enough weight to make hardened cavalry officers nervous. And this man, this wounded warrior she'd dragged through 20 miles of hostile country, was his nephew. "General Howard gave me this after the treaty talks at Apache Pass," Kasai continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "He said it would mark me as someone under his protection, someone who could move between the white world and Apache world as a bridge. For 5 years I have carried it, using it to trade, to negotiate, to keep my people fed when the reservation rations fail." "And yesterday?" Julia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Yesterday I was returning from Fort Bowie with supplies, medicine mostly, and blankets for the winter camps." Kasai's jaw tightened. "The Clanton gang has been raiding supply trains for months, but they have always avoided Apache traders. We are too much trouble, too likely to bring reprisal. But someone told them what I carried. Someone said the nephew of Cochise would be worth taking alive. Worth ransoming." Julia felt cold despite the growing warmth of the morning. "They knew who you were. They knew," Kasai confirmed. "Which means someone at the fort told them. Someone who should not have. The Teamsters tried to fight. They died quickly. I fought longer. Killed 2 of them before a blade found me. I fell, and they thought me dead. They took the supply wagons and left me bleeding. And if they find out you're alive," Julia said slowly, working through the implications, "they will come for me," Kasai finished. "And they will come for you. Because you are the woman who saved me. You are the witness who can identify them. You are the problem that needs eliminating." The weight of that settled over Julia like a burial shroud. She'd known helping him was dangerous, but she'd been thinking in terms of abstract risk, of general bandit threats. Now it was concrete, specific. Men with names and faces and a very particular reason to want her dead. "So what do we do?" she asked, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. Kasai studied her for a long moment, something like approval flickering in his expression. "You do not panic, you do not blame me, you do not regret your choice." "Would any of those things help?" Julia replied. "No," Kasai admitted. "We must reach Tucson. My brother Nanton is there. He trades with the merchants. He has connections with the territorial marshal. Once we are under official protection, the Clantons cannot touch us." "How far to Tucson?" Julia asked. 2 days if we move carefully, 1 if we push hard," Kasai said. Then grimaced as he tried to shift position. "But I cannot ride, not yet. The wound must have time, or it will tear open, and I will bleed out in your wagon." Julia made a decision with the same swift certainty that had made her drag him from the massacre site. "Then we take 2 days, we move carefully, we stay off the main route. And we get you to your brother alive. The Clantons will be looking," Kasai warned. "Let them look," Julia said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I've gotten good at not being found." They broke camp within the hour. Julia hitched Chester to the wagon, packed everything with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light and fast. She spread blankets over Kasai to make him less visible, leaving only a small gap for air. Then climbed onto the driver's bench and guided them back toward the main canyon. The route she chose wound through the narrowest passages, places where the rock walls pressed close enough to scrape the wagon sides. Where the shadow lay thick even at midday, it was slower, harder on Chester. But it kept them hidden from anyone watching the more traveled paths. They moved in silence, Julia's ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Any indication that the Clantons had discovered their prey still lived, behind her in the wagon bed. Kasai lay quiet, conserving his strength, his hand resting on the knife he'd insisted on keeping within reach. The morning wore into afternoon, the heat building until the air shimmered and danced. Julia stopped twice to let Chester rest, to give Kasai water, to check that his wound hadn't reopened. Each stop felt like tempting fate. But pushing too hard would kill them just as surely as being caught. It was during the second stop, with the sun past its zenith and starting its slow descent, that Julia heard the horses. The sound came from ahead, from around a bend in the canyon where the walls opened into a wider area. Multiple horses moving at a walk, the casual pace of men who weren't worried about being caught. Men who owned this territory through violence and intimidation. Julia's hand flew to the blankets covering Kasai, pressing them down in a silent warning to stay still. Then she grabbed the reins and looked frantically for options. Behind them the canyon narrowed to nothing. Ahead lay whoever was coming. And to either side rose sheer rock walls 30 feet high. They were trapped. The voices reached her before the riders came into view. Rough male voices, relaxed and joking. The sound of men enjoying their work. I'm telling you. That Apache was dead, one voice said. I put my blade in him proper. He ain't getting up from that. Better be, another voice replied, harder, carrying authority. Because if Vic finds out we left Cochise's nephew alive to tell tales, he'll skin us both. Julia's mind raced. She couldn't turn around without being seen. Couldn't hide, couldn't fight. All she had was a half-trained mule, a wagon full of books and a dying war chief, and a revolver with 6 bullets against however many men were about to round that corner. The first rider appeared, and Julia's breath caught. He was young, maybe 25, with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't decorated with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He wore 2 pistols and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His eyes found Julia and her wagon, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Well now, he said, his voice carrying back to whoever followed. What do we have here? 2 more riders emerged, both older. Both hard-faced men with the look of career outlaws. The one in the middle, clearly the leader, had gray streaking his beard and eyes like chips of flint. He studied Julia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Ma'am, the gray-bearded man said, his tone almost polite. You're a long way from anywhere safe, traveling alone. My husband's meeting me in Tucson, Julia lied, keeping her voice steady. I'm running late. He'll be worried. The young one with the scar laughed. Husband lets his wife travel these canyons alone. He's either a fool or you're lying. My money's on lying. Now. Jake, the gray-bearded man said mildly, let's not be rude, ma'am. I'm Victor Clanton. These are my associates. We've had some trouble in these parts. Apache trouble. You wouldn't have seen anything unusual, would you? Julia's hand rested on the seat beside her, inches from her revolver. Just rock and heat and more rock, Mr. Clanton. I'm trying to reach Tucson before dark. So if you'll excuse me. Victor Clanton's eyes narrowed. Before dark, that's ambitious. Especially with a wagon heavy as yours looks. What are you carrying? Books, Julia said. I'm a teacher. Everything I own is in that wagon. Books, Jake repeated, his scarred face splitting into a grin. Well, we should check that. Make sure you're not smuggling anything dangerous. You know, for your own safety. He dismounted and started toward the wagon. And Julia knew with crystalline clarity that in about 5 seconds he was going to pull back those blankets and find Kasai. And then all 3 of them would draw their guns and she would die here in this canyon. Her body left for the vultures, her name forgotten. Another casualty of the territory's casual violence. But Julia had not survived Thomas's death, had not fled Santa Fe, had not dragged a wounded war chief through hostile country, just to die without fighting back. Her hand closed around the revolver and she brought it up smoothly, pointing it directly at Victor Clanton's chest. That's close enough, she said. Her voice cold and clear. Jake froze, his hand on the wagon side. Victor Clanton's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew colder, calculating. "Now, ma'am, that's not friendly. I'm not feeling friendly," Julia replied. "I'm feeling tired, scared, and about one insult away from shooting the first man who moves wrong. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to back away from my wagon. You're going to get back on your horses, and you're going to ride away. And I'm going to forget I ever saw you." "3 guns against 1, the third rider said, speaking for the first time. "Them's bad odds, lady." "True," Julia agreed. "But I only need to shoot one of you to make this a very bad day. And I'm pointing at your boss, so ask yourself."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
"Is whatever he's paying you worth finding out if I'm bluffing?" The silence stretched, broken only by Chester's nervous stamping and the distant cry of a hawk. Victor Clanton studied Julia with those flint eyes, and she could see him weighing options, calculating risks, deciding if a lone woman with a gun was worth the trouble. Then, slowly, he smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Julia had ever seen. "You've got spine, I'll give you that, Jake. Leave the ladies' books alone, we've got other business." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Victor's tone killed the protest. He backed away from the wagon, mounted his horse, and the 3 riders sat there for one more long moment. 3 predators deciding if prey was worth the chase. "Ma'am," Victor finally said, tipping his hat in a mockery of courtesy, "I hope your husband appreciates what he's got. A woman with that much backbone is rare, but these canyons are dangerous. All sorts of accidents can happen to folks traveling alone. You be careful now." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in polite words but sharp as broken glass. Julia kept her revolver trained on him until they turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, disappearing around the bend, the sound of hoofbeats fading slowly into silence. Only when she was absolutely certain they were gone did Julia lower the gun. And only then did her hands start shaking. The delayed reaction to how close they'd come. How thin the margin between life and death had been. The blankets stirred and Kosai's face emerged. "Pale but alert. You have steel in your spine." "Julia Sinclair," he said quietly. "Most women would have panicked, most men too." "I didn't have time to panic," Julia replied, her voice shaking now even if her hands weren't. "Are you all right? Did anything tear?" "I am well," Kosai assured her, "but we must move. They will circle back once they realize what they missed. They will return with more men." Julia nodded, gathered the reins, and urged Chester forward, her brief moment of relief evaporating into renewed urgency. Behind them, she knew, men were making plans. And ahead the canyon wound through endless miles of stone and shadow, each bend potentially hiding death, but she'd bought them time. Had faced down 3 killers and lived toe-tail about it. And if she could do that, maybe, just maybe, she could get them both to Tucson alive. The sun continued its descent as they pushed deeper into the dragoons. And Julia Sinclair, widow and teacher and now fugitive, drove her wagon forward with her revolver on the seat beside her and a war chief's life in her hands, wondering how one act of mercy had transformed her from victim of circumstance into player in a game whose rules she barely understood. But she would learn, she had to, because turning back was no longer an option, and the only way out was forward, through bandit country and danger and the uncertain promise of sanctuary in a town she'd never seen. Night fell over the Dragoon Mountains with the sudden finality of a door slamming shut. One moment the western sky blazed orange and crimson. The next darkness claimed the canyon like spilled ink, swallowing everything except the pale ribbon of stars overhead. Julia had pushed Chester hard through the afternoon, driven by the certainty that Victor Clanton's smile had been a promise rather than a concession, that somewhere behind them men were gathering, planning preparing to finish what they'd started. The mule's sides heaved with exhaustion, his head hanging low. But he'd kept moving with the stubborn determination that was either loyalty or simple lack of imagination. She'd found this place just as the last light faded. A narrow cleft in the canyon wall that opened into a small box canyon. Barely large enough for the wagon, but defensible. With only one way in and steep walls on 3 sides. It wasn't perfect, nothing out here was. But it would have to do. Kasai had been silent for the last hour. His breathing steady but shallow, the kind of sleep that comes from a body demanding rest, regardless of circumstance. Julia had checked his wound during their brief water stop. Relieved to find the stitches holding, no fresh blood seeping through the bandages. No smell of infection beginning its deadly work. Now she sat with her back against a boulder, the revolver in her lap, watching the entrance to their small sanctuary while Chester dozed on his feet nearby. She'd considered building a fire, but decided the risk outweighed the comfort. Smoke could be seen for miles in this clear desert air. And she had no intention of announcing their location to anyone hunting them. The cold settled in fast, the way it always did in high desert country, stealing warmth from rock and flesh with indiscriminate efficiency. Julia pulled her shawl tighter and tried not to think about the hot coffee she couldn't make, the warm meal she couldn't cook, the safety she couldn't guarantee. "You should sleep," Kasai's voice came from the wagon. Quiet but alert. "I will keep watch." Julia turned to find him sitting up, still wrapped in blankets but clearly awake. His eyes catching the starlight and reflecting it back. "You need rest more than I do," she said. "That wound will kill you faster than exhaustion will kill me." "The wound is healing," Kasai replied. "My people have survived worse. And I have been listening to your breathing for the past hour. You are afraid, your body is tense. You will not sleep even if you try." Julia couldn't argue with that assessment. "You heard them talking," she said. "About who you are, what you're worth. They know you're Cochise's nephew. They know someone will pay to get you back. Or pay to ensure I do not reach Tucson to testify about their crimes," Kasai said, his voice matter of fact, discussing his potential murder with the same tone another man might use to discuss weather. "The reservation agent, the one who steals from my people. He would gladly pay Clanton to silence me permanently. It would be cheaper than facing a territorial investigation." "How deep does this corruption go?" Julia asked, though she suspected the answer would only deepen her understanding of how much danger they faced. Kasai shifted carefully, moving to sit at the edge of the wagon bed. His feet dangling over the side. "The agent's name is Blackwood. He has been stealing from Apache families for 3 years, selling our rations to miners and ranchers, pocketing money meant to buy medicine and tools. When elders complain, he threatens to withhold all supplies. When young men talk of leaving the reservation to hunt, as our fathers did, he calls in the cavalry to force them back." The bitterness in his voice was raw, undisguised. "My uncle Cochise made peace because he believed it was the only way our people would survive. He believed the promises made by General Howard, that we would have land, food, the right to live according to our ways. But men like Blackwood, they see treaties as inconveniences. They see my people as obstacles to profit." Julia thought about the Santa Fe she'd left behind. About the respectable men who'd cheated Thomas. About the society that had blamed her for her husband's crimes, while excusing the criminals who'd created him. Corruption wasn't unique to the frontier. It just wore its face more openly here. "Your brother in Tucson," she said. "Nanton, you trust him to help us. Nanton is careful, calculating. He has built relationships with merchants and lawmen through years of honest dealing. He supplies Apache craftwork to stores throughout the territory. Baskets and pottery and silverwork that white women buy for their homes." Kasai's expression softened slightly. He understood what I did not at first, that survival sometimes requires adapting. becoming part of two worlds instead of clinging only to one. "And you," Julia asked, "which world do you belong to?" Kasaya was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I belong to neither and both. I am Apache, that will never change, but I speak English and Spanish. I understand contracts and negotiations. I know that my people cannot win a war against the Americans. There are too many of you, with too many guns. Too much will to take what you want, so I fight a different kind of war. One fought with words and witnesses and forcing men like Blackwood to face consequences. A war that got you stabbed and left for dead," Julia pointed out. "Yes," Kasai agreed, "but I am not dead. Thanks to a woman who had every reason to leave me bleeding in the dirt. Who risked her life for a stranger from a people she was taught to fear. That is worth something, Julia Sinclair. That changes the story." Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "I just did what anyone decent would do." "No," Kasai said firmly. "You did what few would do, what most could not do. You chose mercy when the world rewards cruelty. You chose risk when safety was walking away. Do not diminish that choice by calling it ordinary." Before Julia could respond, Chester's head came up sharply, his ears swiveling toward the canyon entrance, a low nervous sound rumbling in his throat. Julia's hand closed around the revolver as she rose to her feet. Every muscle suddenly tense, Kasai moved with surprising speed for an injured man. Sliding from the wagon and pressing himself against the rock wall near the entrance. His knife appearing in his hand as if by magic, they waited in silence, barely breathing, listening for whatever had spooked the mule. The sound came again, faint but distinct. The scrape of boot leather on stone, the quiet jingle of a spur someone had forgotten to muffle, the whispered curse of a man who'd stumbled in the darkness. They'd been found, Julia counted footsteps. At least 3 men, maybe 4, moving carefully through the narrow entrance to their box canyon. Trying for stealth, but hampered by unfamiliar terrain and overconfidence. She caught Kasai's eye and saw him hold up 4 fingers, confirming her count. 4 armed men against a wounded Apache and a schoolteacher with 6 bullets. The odds were impossibly bad. But Julia had learned in the past 24 hours that impossible didn't mean surrender. It just meant you had to be smarter, faster, more ruthless than the people trying to kill you. "We know you're in here," a voice called out, not Victor Clanton but someone younger. Probably Jake with his scarred face and cocky swagger. "Saw your wagon tracks leading in. There's no other way out. So why don't you make this easy on yourself, lady? Just hand over the Apache and we'll let you go." "You got my word," Julia almost laughed at that. The word of a man who murdered freighters and left wounded men to die. Worth less than the air it traveled through. She stayed silent, letting them wonder. Letting their imagination work against them. "Maybe she ain't here," another voice suggested. "Maybe she unhitched the mule and went on foot." "With a half-dead Indian," Jake scoffed. "Use your head, she's here. Probably hiding behind that wagon, scared out of her mind." Kasai touched Julia's arm and gestured toward a pile of loose rocks near the canyon wall. She understood immediately. If they could create enough confusion, enough chaos, they might buy themselves a chance. She nodded and Kasai moved silently toward the rocks. His injured side clearly paining him, but his movements still fluid. Controlled, he positioned himself and waited for her signal. Julia took a deep breath, aimed her revolver at a point roughly 10 feet to the right of where she thought the men were standing, and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, the bullets sparking off rock and ricocheting with a high whine that sent the searchers diving for cover. In the same instant, Kasai heaved against the pile of rocks, sending an avalanche of stone tumbling down the slope. The crash and clatter drowning out shouts and curses. Julia fired twice more, not aiming to hit but to drive them back. To make them think they'd walked into a trap rather than cornered desperate prey. She heard running footsteps, someone crashing into someone else. A yelp of pain as a ricocheting stone found flesh. "Fall back," Jake's voice shouted, authority cracking around the edges into something that might have been fear. "Fall back to the entrance, regroup." The sounds of retreat were hasty and undignified. Men scrambling over each other to get out of the death funnel they'd thought would be easy pickings. Within seconds, the canyon was quiet again, except for the fading echo of gunshots and the rattle of settling stones. Julia stood frozen, her revolver still raised. Her heart hammering so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. 3 shots gone, 3 bullets left. And she had no illusions that Jake and his companions had given up. Kasai materialized beside her. His face pale, but his eyes fierce with something that might have been satisfaction. "They expected a frightened woman," he said quietly. "Instead they found a warrior. They will be more careful now." "More careful means more dangerous," Julia replied. "We can't hold this position. Not against 4 men who can just wait us out. We have no food, limited water. And you need medical attention. You're not getting out here." "Then we leave," Kasai said simply, "before they can organize a proper siege." "Leave how?" Julia demanded, gesturing at the canyon walls. "There's only one way out, and they're blocking it." Kasai pointed upward, toward this steep slope at the back of the box canyon. Barely visible in the starlight, there, where the wall is broken. "It will be difficult, especially for me, but it leads to a ridge that connects to another canyon system. One that winds toward Tucson through paths too narrow for horses." Julia studied the slope, her stomach sinking. It was nearly vertical in places, loose scree and sharp rocks. The kind of climb that killed people even in daylight with proper equipment. "You can't climb that," she said flatly, "not with that wound." "I can if you help me," Kasai replied, "and I must. Because staying here means dying slowly or surrendering." "And I will do neither." Julia looked at Chester. At the wagon full of books that represented everything she'd salvaged from her old life. At the supplies she'd need to start over in Tucson. All of it about to be abandoned, left behind for Victor Clanton to loot or burn. Thomas's voice whispered in her memory, something he'd said during one of his rare moments of honesty. "Julia, you hold on to things too tight. Someday you're going to have to learn the difference between what you need and what you can afford to lose." She'd hated him for saying it then, thought it was just another excuse for his recklessness. But standing here in the dark with killers waiting and a dying man depending on her, she finally understood. "All right," she said, holstering her revolver and moving to the wagon. "We climb, but first I take what matters." She grabbed a canteen, a small sack of dried meat and hardtack, her spare ammunition, and one book, just one. A volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that her mother had given her before she died. Then she turned to Kasai and held out her arm. "Let's go," she said. "Before they figure out we're not staying put." The climb was everything Julia had feared and worse. The slope was treacherous with loose rock that shifted under their feet, sending cascades of stone clattering down into the canyon below. Every sound felt like a scream announcing their position. But somehow the men at the entrance didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they were still regrouping. Still nursing bruised pride and lucky escapes from ricocheting bullets. Kasai moved like a man forcing body to obey will through pure stubborn determination. His breathing came in harsh gasps, his face sheened with sweat despite the cold. Twice he stumbled, and Julia had to brace herself to keep them both from tumbling backward, her shoulders screaming with the effort of supporting his weight. They were halfway up when she heard Victor Clanton's voice echoing from below. Calm and controlled, more frightening than Jake's earlier bluster. "Jake, take 2 men around the north rim. See if there's another way in. The rest of you, gather firewood. We're going to smoke them out." Julia's blood went cold. Smoke in a confined space like the box canyon would be lethal, suffocating, inescapable. They had minutes at most before someone looked up and spotted them on the slope. Move, she hissed at Kosai, abandoning caution for speed. They scrambled upward in a desperate rush, rocks skittering away beneath them. Julia's hands torn and bleeding from grabbing sharp stone. Kosai's wound seeping fresh blood that she could feel soaking through his shirt where she gripped him. The top of the ridge seemed impossibly far, then suddenly it was right there. Julia hauled herself over the edge and turned to pull Kosai up after her. They collapsed together on flat ground, gasping for breath, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Below them, she could see the flicker of torches being lit, hear voices organizing the hunt. But up here on the ridge the darkness was complete, concealing. And if they moved quickly, they could disappear into the maze of canyons before Clanton realized his prey had slipped the trap. "Can you walk?" Julia asked, already knowing she'd carry him if necessary. "I can run if I must," Kosai replied, pushing himself to his feet with visible effort. "This way. Stay low." The ridge connects to a descent path about 200 yards east. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, following the ridgeline with Kosai's hand on Julia's shoulder for guidance. His knowledge of this terrain proving that what he'd said earlier was true. He belonged to this land in ways Julia never would. Every rock and turn familiar even in the dark. Behind them, a shout went up. Someone had discovered the empty canyon, the abandoned wagon. The realization that their quarry had escaped. Julia didn't look back, just kept moving, following Kosai's whispered directions as they descended into a new canyon system. This one narrower, twisting, impossible to navigate on horseback. They walked for hours through the darkness, sometimes on trails that might have been game paths, sometimes just picking their way across bare rock. Kosai's breathing grew more labored with each mile, his weight heavier on Julia's shoulder as his strength failed. But he never asked to stop, never suggested surrender. Dawn found them in a narrow defile where a seasonal stream had carved smooth channels through red stone. Kosai finally allowed himself to sink down against a boulder, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Julia examined his wound and found what she'd feared. The stitches had torn during the climb, fresh blood mixing with old. "I need to re-stitch this," she said, digging through her small pack for needle and thread. "And you need to rest, properly rest, not this running for our lives nonsense." "Tucson is 10 miles, Kosai said, his voice thin but determined. "Nathan's shop is on the east end of town, near the mission, if we can reach it by nightfall." "Then we'll reach it," Julia interrupted, threading the needle with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. "But first I fix this, because I didn't drag you through the dragoons just to have you die from blood loss a few miles from safety." Kosai watched her work with those dark eyes that saw too much, understood too clearly. "Why do you do this?" he asked quietly. "Truly, you could have left me a dozen times. Saved yourself, yet you stay, you fight. You risk everything for a man you did not know yesterday." Julia focused on her stitching, on the familiar rhythm of needle through flesh, on anything except the question that demanded more honesty than she'd given herself. "Because I'm tired of being the kind of person things happen to," she finally said. "I'm tired of running from other people's choices, tired of being a victim of circumstance. When I found you bleeding in that canyon, I had a choice. Maybe the first real choice I've had since Thomas died. And I chose to be someone who helps, someone who fights, someone who doesn't let the Victor Clantons of this world dictate what's right through violence and intimidation." She tied off the last stitch and looked up to find Kosai watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You are not just fighting for me," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Julia admitted. "I'm fighting for the person I want to be, the person I should have been all along." Kosai nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then we will reach Tucson together," he said. "And when we arrive, when we tell our story to people who matter, you will have helped start something larger than either of us. You will have struck a blow against corruption, that has harmed hundreds. If we survive to tell it, Julia said, bandaging the fresh stitches. We will survive, Kasai said with absolute certainty, because you are too stubborn to die. And I have too much work left unfinished. Julia laughed despite everything. Despite exhaustion and fear, and the certainty that Clanton's men were still hunting them. Then let's stop talking about survival and start ensuring it, she said, offering her hand to help him stand. 10 miles to Tucson, we can do that. They left the defile as the sun climbed higher. Two unlikely allies bound together by circumstance and choice, walking toward a city that might offer sanctuary or might deliver them to their enemies. Neither knowing which, but both determined to see it through. Because some choices once made become who you are. And Julia Sinclair had chosen to be someone worth being. The outskirts of Tucson appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage. Low adobe buildings, the color of dried clay, stretching along the valley floor. Church bells drifting across the desert with the lazy afternoon breeze. Julia had never been so grateful to see civilization in her life. They'd made the final miles in a fog of exhaustion and pain. Kosame leaning heavily on her shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. The fresh stitches holding despite the punishment of their journey. Twice they'd heard riders in the distance and had hidden among rocks until the sounds faded. Whether Clanton's men or innocent travelers they couldn't know and didn't dare find out. Now standing on a ridge overlooking the town, Julia felt the weight of the past 2 days settle over her like a physical thing. Her dress was torn and filthy. Her hands wrapped in strips of fabric torn from her petticoat to protect the cuts and blisters. Her face sunburned and dust-caked, she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who'd crawled through hell and barely made it out alive. Nanan's shop, Kasai said, his voice rough with thirst despite the water they'd rationed carefully. There, near the mission with the white walls. You see the building with the blue door. Julia followed his gaze and spotted it. A modest structure that looked more prosperous than its neighbors. With clean windows and what appeared to be displays of pottery and basketwork visible even from this distance. Can you make it? She asked, studying his face. The gray pallor beneath bronze skin, the way he held himself too carefully, protecting the wound that threatened to tear open again with any wrong movement. I will make it, Kasai replied, and started down the slope without waiting for further discussion. Julia hurried to match his pace, ready to catch him if he stumbled. The streets of Tucson were busy with late afternoon commerce. Freight wagons rumbling past, women with parasols browsing storefront displays. Miners and ranchers conducting business in saloons and trading posts. Julia drew stares. A bedraggled white woman supporting an Apache warrior through town was unusual enough to warrant attention. Whispers followed in their wake. Keep moving, Kasai murmured. Do not stop, do not explain. Nanton's shop, that is all that matters. They were 50 yards from the blue door when Julia saw them. 3 men on horseback at the far end of the street. Too distant to identify clearly, but something about the way they sat their horses. The way they scanned the crowds with predatory focus sent ice down her spine. Kasai, she said quietly, behind us riders. He glanced back and his jaw tightened. Clanton's men, they must have taken the main trail. Arrived ahead of us, move faster. They were 30 yards from safety when one of the riders spotted them. Julia saw the moment of recognition, saw the man lean toward his companions and point. Saw all 3 turn their horses and start pushing through the crowd. 20 yards, Kasai stumbled and nearly went down. Julia caught him, half carrying him now. Her muscles screaming in protest. People were stopping to stare, stepping back to clear a path. Whether from concern or simple unwillingness to get involved, she couldn't tell. 10 yards, the riders were closer. One of them dismounting, his hand moving toward his gun. Julia could see his face now, not Jake or Victor, but a third man she'd seen at the canyon. Hard-eyed and methodical, 5 yards, Julia crashed through the blue door with Kasai, nearly falling as they stumbled into the shop's cool interior, her hand fumbling for the revolver at her belt. The shop was larger inside than it appeared from the street. Walls lined with shelves displaying Apache craftwork, baskets woven in intricate patterns, pottery painted with traditional designs, silverwork that caught the light from high windows, and standing behind a wooden counter, a man who could only be Nanton. He was older than Kasai by perhaps 10 years, his face carrying the same strong features but weathered differently, lines etched by negotiation rather than warfare. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, his brother bleeding and barely conscious. A white woman with wild eyes and a gun. "Brother," Kasai said in Apache. Words Julia couldn't understand but whose urgency needed no translation. Nanton responded in the same language, already moving around the counter. But before he could reach them, the blue door burst open again. The hard-eyed man stood in the doorway, his gun drawn. 2 more shapes visible behind him in the street. "That's far enough," he said, his voice flat and professional. "The Apache comes with us, the woman too. Mr. Clanton wants to have a conversation about stolen property and dead freighters. This is my shop," Nanton said, his English perfect and unaccented. "You have no authority here, and you are threatening customers. I suggest you leave before I summon the marshal." The hard-eyed man smiled without humor. "Marshal's out of town, won't be back till tomorrow."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
So right now it's just us having a friendly discussion about how these two are going to walk out of here nice and quiet. Julia raised her revolver, her hand surprisingly steady despite exhaustion. "We're not going anywhere with you," she said. "And you're not taking him, lady. You got 3 bullets left at most," the hard-eyed man said. "I got 6, and my boys outside got 12 more between them. You really want to play this out?" Before Julia could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "But I have 8. And I am very curious about what brings Clanton's dogs into my establishment, threatening my brother." Julia's eyes flicked to the doorway that led to the back of the shop. A woman stood there. Apache like Kasai and Nanton, but her dress was a blend of traditional and modern buckskin, decorated with silver buttons. Her long black hair braided with red ribbon, and in her hand she held a rifle, aimed directly at the hard-eyed man's chest with the casual competence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Aida," Kasai breathed, something like relief flooding his face. The hard-eyed man's confidence faltered, his eyes darting between Julia's revolver, the woman's rifle, and Nanton, who'd produced a pistol from beneath his counter. "This ain't over," he said, backing toward the door. "Mr. Clanton don't forget, he don't forgive. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Then delay we shall," Nanton said calmly. "Now leave before my sister loses patience. She has considerably less restraint than I do." The hard-eyed man retreated through the door, his companions already mounting their horses. Within seconds they were gone, disappearing into the flow of street traffic. But Julia knew with sick certainty that this was just a pause, not a resolution. The moment the door closed, Kasai's legs gave out. Julia and Nanton caught him together. Lowering him carefully to the floor, Aida set down her rifle and was beside them in an instant, her hands moving over Kasai's wound with practiced efficiency. "How long has he been bleeding?" she demanded, looking at Julia with eyes that assessed and judged in equal measure. "I stitched it this morning," Julia said. "But he tore the first set climbing out of a box canyon yesterday. He needs a doctor." "No doctor will come for an Apache," Aida said flatly. "I will treat him. I have done so many times before, Nanton. Help me get him to the back room. You," she fixed Julia with a sharp look. "You will tell me everything that happened, every detail while I work." The back room of the shop was part storage area, part living quarters, with a small bed against one wall and shelves stacked with supplies. They laid Kasai on the bed, and Aida immediately began cutting away Julia's makeshift bandages. Her movements sure and skilled, Julia told the story while Aida worked. Starting with finding Kasai in the canyon and ending with their desperate arrival in Tucson. Nanton listened with the focused attention of someone gathering evidence, his face growing darker as the full picture emerged. "Blackwood," Nanton said when Julia finished. "I have suspected for months that he was involved in something beyond simple theft. But this, conspiring with bandits, ordering murder, this goes far beyond corruption." "Can you prove it?" Julia asked. "My word against his. I'm a widow with no standing, no connections." "But you are a witness," Nanton replied. "And more importantly, Kasai is a witness with authority. His testimony carries weight because of who his uncle was, because of the treaties he helped negotiate, and you, Julia Sinclair. You are a white woman who risked everything to save an Apache. That story will spread. It will matter to people who might otherwise dismiss our complaints as tribal grievances." Aida finished cleaning and restitching Kasai's wound, her hands gentle despite her sharp manner. "He will live," she announced. "But he needs rest, days of it, not hours. His body has been pushed beyond reasonable limits, days we may not have," Nanton said. Looking toward the front of the shop where the windows faced the street, "Clanton will not simply give up. He has too much at stake. He will try again. Probably tonight when the streets are empty. Then we need protection," Julia said, her mind working through options with the clarity that comes from extended crisis. "Official protection, someone Clanton can't simply murder without consequence." "The marshal returns tomorrow," Nanton said, "if we can survive until then." "There is another option," Aida said quietly. "The Fort Lowell is only 6 miles from here. If Kasai can reach the commander, if he can present evidence of Blackwood's corruption and Clanton's crimes, the army must act, must they?" Julia said skeptically. "From what Kasai told me, the army hasn't been particularly concerned with Apache welfare." "True," Aida admitted, "but attacking a peace negotiator, killing freighters, raiding supply trains, those are crimes that threaten everyone. Not just Apache and the fort commander, Captain Morrison. He is one of the few who takes treaty obligations seriously. He served under General Howard, respected him." Nanton nodded slowly. "It could work if we can get word to him tonight. If he agrees to send protection, I will go," Julia said. The words out before she'd fully thought them through. But once spoken, she knew they were right. "I'm a white woman. The sentries won't shoot me on sight. I can reach the fort. Explain what happened. Bring help back." "Alone," Aida said. "At night, through country where Clanton's men are hunting." "That is suicide. It's the only chance," Julia countered. "Kasai can't travel. You two need to protect him here. I'm the expendable piece in this game." "You are not expendable," Nanton said firmly. "You saved my brother's life. You are under my protection now. That means something." Julia felt unexpected warmth at those words. This stranger claiming her as family based solely on her actions. "Then protect me by letting me do what needs doing," she said. "Give me a fast horse, directions to the fort, and trust that I haven't survived this long just to die 6 miles from safety." The siblings exchanged a long look, some communication passing between them that needed no words. Finally, Nanton nodded. "There is a horse in the stable behind the shop. A mare named Storm. She is fast and knows the route to the fort. Follow the road north until you see the fork marked with 3 stones. Take the left path. It is longer but safer, less exposed. And take this," Aida said, pressing a small leather pouch into Julia's hand. "If you are stopped, show them this. It bears our mark. Any Apache who sees it will know you are friend, not enemy." Julia tucked the pouch into her dress, checked her revolver, 3 bullets left just as the hard-eyed man had guessed. Not much, but better than nothing. She looked at Kosa, still unconscious on the bed, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. "Tell him I kept my promise," she said to Nanton. "Tell him I got him to safety." "Tell him yourself when you return with the soldiers," Nanton replied, leading her through the back door to where the stable waited. Storm was a beautiful animal, dark gray with intelligent eyes. She accepted Julia's unfamiliar weight without protest, responding to the lightest pressure on the reins. Julia had learned to ride as a girl, but it had been years. Muscle memory returned slowly as they left the stable and headed north through Tucson's back streets. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Casting long shadows that could hide anything, Julia kept Storm to a steady trot. Not fast enough to draw attention, but not so slow they'd be easy targets. Her eyes constantly scanning for threats. She'd made it perhaps 2 miles when she heard the horses behind her, multiple riders, closing fast. Julia's heart hammered as she urged Storm into a gallop, the mare responding instantly, stretching into a run that ate up ground with powerful strides. The fork with 3 stones appeared ahead. Julia yanked the reins left, taking the safer route Nanton had described. The path wound through rocky terrain that slowed her pursuers. She could hear them cursing, their horses struggling with the uneven ground. A gunshot cracked through the dusk, the bullet singing past Julia's head close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. She leaned low over Storm's neck, urging every bit of speed from the mare, praying the gathering darkness would make her a harder target. The fort appeared like salvation, walls and guard towers silhouetted against the dying light. Julia aimed straight for the main gate, shouting before she reached it, "Help! I need help! Emergency!" Soldiers appeared, rifles raised, a sergeant stepping forward with his hand up. "Halt! Identify yourself!" Julia hauled Storm to a stop, nearly falling from the saddle in her exhaustion. "My name is Julia Sinclair. I need to speak to Captain Morrison immediately. It concerns Agent Blackwood and an attack on Apache traders. There are men chasing me. Clanton's gang, please. Lives depend on this." The sergeant's eyes narrowed, taking in her appearance, the desperation in her voice. Then he looked past her to where dust clouds marked approaching riders. "Get her inside," he barked to his men, "and prepare to turn away those riders. If they're who she says they are, they have no business at this fort." Julia was rushed through the gate as it swung shut behind her. The sound of it closing was the sweetest thing she'd heard in days. Soldiers took Storm's reins. Other hands steadied her as she dismounted on legs that barely held her weight. "Take me to Captain Morrison," she said to the sergeant. "Please, I have information he needs to hear. Information about corruption and murder and a conspiracy that threatens the peace." The sergeant studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Follow me, ma'am." "But the captain is not a man who appreciates his time being wasted." "I'm not wasting it," Julia said, straightening despite exhaustion. "I'm about to give him the chance to be a hero or a coward. Which one he chooses is up to him." The sergeant's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing. Just led her across the fort compound toward a building where lamplight glowed in the windows, toward a confrontation that would determine whether the past 2 days of suffering and struggle had meaning, or whether corruption would win simply because it was easier than fighting. Julia thought of Kosa, of the promise she'd made to get him to safety, of the choice she'd made in that canyon to be someone who helped rather than someone who looked away. And she walked into Captain Morrison's office with her head high and her voice steady, ready to tell a story that needed to be heard whether anyone wanted to listen or not. Because some fights, once started, have to be finished. And Julia Sinclair had learned that the only thing more dangerous than fighting was giving up. Captain Morrison was not what Julia expected. She'd been prepared for a hardened cavalry officer with contempt for Apache and civilians alike. Instead, she found a man in his 40s with graying temples and eyes that held both weariness and something that might have been integrity. He listened without interruption as Julia told her story, his expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on paper that sat before him on a desk cluttered with reports and maps. When she finished, he set down his pen and studied her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "That's quite a tale, Mrs. Sinclair," he said finally, his voice neutral. "Accusations of conspiracy, murder, corruption involving a federal agent. These are serious charges that require serious evidence." "I have evidence," Julia said, pulling the silver medallion from her pocket and placing it on his desk. General Howard's medallion, given to Kasai as protection. That alone proves who he is and what he represents. Morrison picked up the medallion, turning it over in his hands. Something shifted in his expression when he saw Howard's name engraved on the edge. "I knew the general," he said quietly, "served under him during the treaty negotiations. He gave his word to Cochise that men like Kasai would be protected. That promise was supposed to mean something." "Then make it mean something," Julia said. Leaning forward, "Send soldiers to Nanton's shop. Protect Kasai until he can give his testimony. Arrest Blackwood. Bring Victor Clanton to justice. Do what you took an oath to do." Morrison was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. "If I send troops into Tucson based solely on your word, if I arrest a federal agent without proper authority, I could face court-martial," he said. But his tone suggested he was working through the problem rather than dismissing it. "And if you do nothing," Julia countered, "an Apache peace negotiator dies. A federal agent continues stealing from people under government protection. And a gang of murderers goes unpunished. Which of those outcomes can you live with?" "Captain," Morrison's jaw tightened. Then he stood abruptly and moved to the door. "Sergeant Blake," he called. "I need Lieutenant Hartwell and 20 men. Armed and ready to ride in 10 minutes. Relief flooded through Julia so suddenly her legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "You'll ride with us," Morrison said, turning back to her. "I'll need you to identify Nanton's shop. And possibly the men who attacked you, but Mrs. Sinclair, understand this. If your story proves false, if this is some elaborate scheme, you'll face federal charges for making false accusations against a government official." "My story is true," Julia said firmly, "every word. And I'll swear to it before any court in the territory." 20 minutes later, Julia rode through the fort gates again, this time surrounded by cavalry soldiers with rifles and purpose. Morrison led them at a hard pace toward Tucson, the horses' hooves thundering across the desert floor as twilight deepened into night. They reached the edge of town as full darkness settled. Morrison slowed the column and turned to Julia. "Which way?" he asked. "East," Julia pointed, "toward the mission. The shop with the blue door." Morrison signaled his men forward at a walk, trying for stealth despite the impossibility of moving 20 mounted soldiers quietly through narrow streets. Townspeople scattered before them, whispers spreading like wildfire. Nanton's shop appeared ahead, lamplight visible through the windows, but something was wrong. Julia could feel it in the tension of the air, in the way shadows moved too deliberately in the alley beside the building. "Captain," she said urgently. "Something's happening." Morrison saw it too. He raised his hand and the column stopped, then motioned for his men to spread out. To surround the shop, soldiers dismounted silently, checking weapons, waiting for orders. The front door of the shop burst open and Aida stumbled out, blood running from a cut on her forehead. Behind her came 2 of Clanton's men, guns drawn. "Nobody move," one of them shouted, pressing his pistol against Aida's spine, "or the Apache woman dies right here." Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm, but Julia grabbed his wrist. "Wait," she hissed, "there's more inside. If shooting starts, Kasai could be killed." "Then what do you suggest?" Morrison demanded. Julia didn't answer with words. Instead, she urged Storm forward, hands raised and empty. Riding slowly toward the gunman holding Aida. "Let her go," Julia called out, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "You want me. I'm the witness. I'm the one who can identify you." "She's just protecting her family, Julia." "No." Aida's voice rang out sharp with fear. The gunman's eyes narrowed. "Well, now, this makes things easier. Victor's gonna be pleased we got both the Apache and the nosy schoolteacher boys," he called into the shop. "Bring out the other one." Jake emerged. His scarred face split in a grin. Dragging Kasai between him and another man, Kasai was conscious but barely. His wound bleeding fresh, his face gray with pain. "Whole family reunion," Jake said. "Ain't that sweet?" Julia slid from Storm's saddle, her hands still raised, moving slowly toward them. Behind her, she could sense Morrison's men tensing. Waiting for a signal, waiting for an opening. "Victor Clanton sent you," Julia said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "To murder Kasai because he witnessed your crimes. To silence me for the same reason. To cover up Agent Blackwood's theft from the reservation." "You talk too much, lady," the gunman holding Aida said. But there was nervousness in his voice now, his eyes darting to the soldiers surrounding them, realizing perhaps that the situation had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I talk exactly enough," Julia replied. "Enough to make sure everyone here knows what you are. Murderers working for a corrupt federal agent. Killing to protect profits stolen from people under government protection." "Enough." Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a saber. He stepped forward, his captain's insignia catching lamplight. "I am Captain David Morrison, United States Cavalry. You are surrounded by federal troops. Put down your weapons and release your hostages." "Now," Jake laughed, a sound edged with desperation. "You think we're scared of you, Captain? You think we don't know how this works? We work for Blackwood. He's got friends in the territorial government. Friends who'll make this all go away." "Perhaps," Morrison said calmly. "But those friends can't help you if you're dead. And my men have orders to shoot if you harm those prisoners. So ask yourself, is Blackwood's money worth dying for?" The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Julia could see the calculations happening behind Jake's eyes, weighing options, measuring chances. Then the gunman holding Aida spoke, his voice shaking. "Jake, there's 20 of them and 4 of us. Vic ain't here to tell us what to do. I ain't dying for this." "Shut up, Lenny," Jake snarled, but doubt had entered his voice. "Drop the gun, Lenny," Morrison said. Addressing the nervous gunman directly, "Walk away from this. Give testimony against Clanton and Blackwood. The territorial prosecutor will show leniency." Lenny's gun wavered, indecision warring with fear, then slowly, carefully. He lowered it and stepped away from Aida. "I'm done," he said. "I'm out. You want answers about who paid for what? I'll tell you everything, you coward," Jake spat. But his grip on Kasai had loosened. Morrison's soldiers were closing in. Rifles raised, escape routes cut off. Julia saw her moment and took it. She lunged forward and grabbed Kasai's arm, yanking him away from Jake's weakened grip. The Apache warrior stumbled, but Julia caught him, dragging him toward the line of soldiers. Jake's gun came up, but Morrison was faster. His pistol cracked once, and Jake's weapon spun from his hand. Blood spraying from torn fingers, he screamed and dropped to his knees. The other 2 men with him immediately raising their hands in surrender. Within seconds it was over. Soldiers swarmed forward, disarming and restraining Clanton's men. A young lieutenant helped Julia lower Kasai to the ground while another soldier tended to Aida's head wound. Nanton emerged from the shop, his face bruised but his eyes fierce with satisfaction. "Captain Morrison," he said formally, "I am Nanton of the Chiricahua. Brother to Kasai. I have documents in my shop. Records of supply purchases that were never delivered. Correspondence that proves Agent Blackwood's involvement in these crimes. Morrison nodded. Secure those documents. Lieutenant Hartwell, I want everything cataloged as evidence. He turned to Julia. His expression softer now. You were right, Mrs. Sinclair, about all of it, and you have my apology for doubting you. Save your apologies for the Apache families Blackwood stole from, Julia said. Kneeling beside Kasai, can you hear me? Kasai's eyes opened, focusing on her with difficulty. You came back, he whispered. You brought the cavalry. I promised to get you to safety, Julia replied. I keep my promises. As do I, Kasai said, his hand fumbling for something inside his shirt. He pulled out a folded paper, worn and stained with blood. This is a letter from General Howard, given to my uncle before his death. It grants me authority to negotiate on behalf of Chiricahua interests, to bring charges against those who violate treaty obligations. With your testimony and my authority, we can destroy Blackwood's career. We can bring justice. Julia took the letter carefully, unfolding it to reveal Howard's signature and seal. Then that's what we'll do, she said, together. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Morrison sent riders to arrest Agent Blackwood, who was found trying to flee with stolen cash and falsified records. Victor Clanton was captured the following morning trying to cross into Mexico. His gang scattered and leaderless without him. Kasai was moved to the fort's infirmary where the post surgeon, after examining his wound, declared it a miracle he'd survived. Another day without proper treatment and infection would have killed him, the doctor said, looking at Julia with something like awe. Whatever you did, however you kept him alive, it saved his life. Julia slept for 16 hours straight in a room Morrison provided. When she finally woke, the sun was high, and someone had left clean clothes and a basin of water outside her door. She washed away 2 days of blood and dirt and dust, dressed in a simple cotton dress that actually fit, and emerged feeling almost human again. Nanton was waiting in the fort's courtyard. Kasai is asking for you, he said. He is recovering well. Already complaining about being confined to bed. This is a good sign. Julia followed him to the infirmary where she found Kasai sitting up, properly bandaged, color returning to his face. Aida sat beside him, the cut on her forehead stitched and healing. Julia Sinclair, Kasai said as she entered, his voice strong again. The woman who saved my life and changed everything. I just did what needed doing, Julia protested. No, Kasai said firmly. You did what few would do. You chose courage over safety, justice over convenience, because of you. Blackwood will face trial, because of you. The families he stole from will receive restitution. Because of you, the Clanton gang is broken. These are not small things. And because of you, Nanton added, we have something to offer. A partnership, if you are interested. Julia blinked. Partnership. Our business is growing, Nanton explained. We need someone who can work with both Apache suppliers and white merchants. Someone who speaks both languages, not just words but cultures. Someone who has proven they can be trusted. We are offering you a position, a salary, a home in Tucson. Julia felt tears sting her eyes. I'm a schoolteacher. I don't know anything about running a business. You learn to stitch wounds in a canyon, Aida said dryly. You learn to face down armed men. You learn to survive impossible odds. You can learn business. And we need a school, Nanton continued. For Apache children who want to learn English. For white children who should learn about their neighbors, you could teach, run the business side. Help us build something larger than any of us could create alone. Julia looked at the three of them, this unlikely family that had claimed her as their own. Thought about the empty life she'd been running toward in Tucson. The anonymous existence she'd planned. Compared it to this offer of purpose, of belonging, of work that mattered. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I accept. 6 months later, Julia stood in the doorway of the school that now occupied the building next to Nanton's expanded shop, watching Apache and white children learning together, stumbling through each other's languages, building friendships that would have been impossible a year ago. The trial had been everything they'd hoped for. Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Clanton received life imprisonment for murder. The territorial governor had personally apologized to Kasai and promised reforms in how reservation agents were monitored. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight. But it was progress, real and measurable, built on the foundation of one woman's choice to help a stranger. Kasai appeared beside her, walking without a limp now. His wound healed to a scar he wore with pride. "Remembering?" he asked. "Always," Julia replied. "Remembering the night I found you bleeding, remembering the choice I made, wondering who I would be now if I'd made a different one." "You would be lost," Kasai said simply. "As I would be dead. Instead we are here, alive, building something neither of us could have imagined alone." Julia thought about Thomas, about Santa Fe, about the woman she'd been who let life happen to her instead of making it happen. That woman felt like a stranger, now someone from another lifetime. "I'm glad I stopped," she said quietly. "Glad I looked, glad I helped." "As am I," Kasai said. Then added with the hint of a smile, "Though perhaps next time you save someone's life, choose circumstances that involve less climbing and fewer bandits." Julia laughed. The sound carrying across the schoolyard where children played without regard for the divisions their parents carried. "No promises," she said. "Trouble seems to find me." "Then it is fortunate you have friends now," Kasai replied. "Friends who will face that trouble beside you." And it was true. Julia realized she had something she'd never had in Santa Fe. Not just friends but family, chosen rather than blood, bound by shared struggle and mutual respect. Nanton and Aida had become the siblings she'd never had. Kasai had become something harder to define. Teacher and student, protector and protected, friend and something perhaps deeper. The school bell rang, calling children back to lessons. Julia moved inside to teach, to shape young minds, to build bridges between worlds that too often saw only differences. That night, sitting with Kasai on the roof of the shop watching stars emerge over the Dragun Mountains, Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here, about bandits and canyons and impossible choices, about mercy extended when logic said walk away. "Do you think it matters?" she asked, "in the grand scheme? Do you think our actions changed anything real?" Kasai was quiet for a moment, then pointed to the school, to the light still burning in one window where a young Apache girl practiced writing English letters under Aida's patient instruction. "That girl's mother died from fever that could have been prevented with medicine Blackwood stole," he said. "Because you saved me, because we stopped him. Other mothers will not die the same way. Other children will not lose their families to preventable disease. Does that matter?" "Yes," Julia said softly, "it matters." "Then do not doubt," Kasai said. "We are all just people making choices, trying to be better than the world expects. You chose to help when you could have looked away. That choice rippled outward, touching lives you will never meet, changing futures you will never see. That is not small, Julia. That is everything." Julia leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars wheel overhead, ancient and indifferent. Below them, Tucson settled into its evening rhythms. A town slowly learning that enemies could become allies, that prejudice could be challenged, that one person's courage could light fires in other hearts. She'd come to Arizona running from her past, expecting nothing more than survival. Instead, she'd found purpose, family, and the understanding that mercy wasn't weakness, but the strongest choice anyone could make. The woman who'd fled Santa Fe wouldn't recognize her now, wouldn't understand the confidence, the belonging, the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. And when Julia finally slept that night, in the small apartment above the shop, surrounded by the sounds of her chosen family, she dreamed not of Thomas or creditors or fear, but of tomorrow, of lessons to teach and businesses to build, and a future written by her own hand. Because sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but from the simple decision to stop when everyone else walks past, to help when helping costs everything, to choose compassion over convenience. Julia had made that choice in a canyon filled with death, and it had saved 2 lives, hers and Kasai's, had toppled corruption and started change that would outlive them both. 1 woman, 1 warrior, 1 moment where everything could have gone differently but didn't. That was the story Julia would tell students in years to come, would share with travelers passing through, would hold close on difficult days when progress seemed impossible. The story of how mercy became justice, how strangers became family, how one impossible night in the Dragoons had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire territory's understanding of what was possible, when people chose to see each other as human first, and everything else second. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains painting the desert gold and red, Julia would wake ready to continue the work, to honor the choice she'd made by making it count for something larger than survival. Because that's what real courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. To be the kind of person the world needed, even when the world made it difficult. Julia Sinclair had learned that lesson bleeding and exhausted in a bandit-filled canyon, had lived it through every mile to Tucson, and would carry it forward through all the years to come. 1 choice, 1 moment, 1 act of mercy that changed everything. The spring of 1878 brought change to Tucson that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Adobe buildings sprouted fresh coats of whitewash. New businesses opened their doors with signs in both English and Apache. And on the eastern edge of town where Nanton's modest shop had once stood alone, a compound of interconnected buildings now housed what the territorial newspapers had begun calling the Sinclair Chiricahua Enterprise. Julia stood in the largest of these buildings, the school that had grown from a single room to 3 classrooms serving 40 students. Watching her assistant teacher, a young Apache woman named Desba, lead a geography lesson that seamlessly blended traditional territorial knowledge with formal American education. The children, ranging from 6 to 14, represented every culture that called Arizona home: Apache, Mexican, white settlers, even 2 Chinese children whose father ran the laundry on Main Street. They learned mathematics and reading, history and science, but also Apache basket weaving, Spanish guitar, and the kind of practical frontier skills that kept people alive in unforgiving country. "Mrs. Sinclair," a voice called from the doorway. Julia turned to find Nanton, dressed in a fine suit that marked his success, but wearing traditional silver work at his collar that proclaimed his heritage. "The territorial inspector is here, earlier than expected." Julia felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. The inspector's visit would determine whether their school received continued territorial funding, whether the partnerships they'd built with reservation communities would be officially recognized, whether 2 years of careful bridge building would be rewarded or dismantled by bureaucratic skepticism. "Show him to my office," Julia said, smoothing her dress. "And Nanton, thank you for the warning." Her office occupied the corner of the building, with windows overlooking both the schoolyard and the workshop where Apache craftspeople trained apprentices in traditional arts. It was a deliberate choice, designed to show visitors the integration they'd achieved, the proof that different cultures could coexist and even thrive together. The inspector was younger than Julia expected, perhaps 30. With a neat beard and eyes that assessed everything with the focus of someone determined to find fault. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said formally, "I am Inspector Thomas Waverly from the Territorial Education Board. I've been sent to evaluate your operation and determine if continued funding is justified. Of course, Mr. Waverly, Julia replied with professional courtesy that masked her nervousness. Please, have a seat. May I offer you coffee? They settled into what Julia had learned was a delicate dance. The inspector asking pointed questions about curriculum and attendance, about the mixing of cultures, about whether Apache children were truly benefiting from American education, or if this was simply an expensive experiment that produced no measurable results. Julia answered each question with facts, with numbers, with examples of students who'd gone on to become translators and negotiators and business owners. She showed him attendance records that proved Apache parents valued education when it was delivered with respect rather than forced assimilation. But Mrs. Sinclair, Waverly said, leaning forward, critics argue that teaching Apache children in their own language, allowing them to maintain traditional practices, this delays their integration into American society. Wouldn't it be more efficient to simply require English only, to eliminate these cultural accommodations? Julia felt anger rise but forced her voice to remain calm. Mr. Waverly, I spent 6 years teaching in Santa Fe using exactly that approach. Forcing students to abandon their language and culture. Do you know what I produced? Children who could recite grammar rules but couldn't think critically, who learned to be ashamed of their heritage but never gained true confidence in their American identity. Here we teach children to be fluent in multiple worlds, to move between cultures with ease. That skill is far more valuable in a territory where cooperation between peoples determines survival. Waverly made notes in his ledger, his expression unreadable. I'd like to observe classes, he said, speak with students. See this integration you describe in action. Of course, Julia agreed, standing. We have nothing to hide. She led him through the school, watching him observe Desba's geography lesson, a mathematics class taught by a retired cavalry sergeant who'd stayed in Tucson after his service ended. A history lesson where students learned about both American expansion and Apache resistance, presenting both perspectives without declaring either wholly right or wrong. In the courtyard during recess, Waverly watched children playing together, Apache and white and Mexican. Their games a hybrid of cultures, their laughter universal. That one, he pointed to a girl with dark braids. Apache, yes, Julia confirmed. That's Nalin, she's our top student in mathematics. She wants to be an engineer. Her father was killed during the Apache Wars. Her mother works in our pottery workshop. And there, Waverly indicated a blond boy helping younger children with a rope game. Settler family, Timothy Morrison, Julia said. His father is Captain Morrison at Fort Lowell. The captain believes his son should understand the people he may one day be ordered to negotiate with or fight against. Understanding prevents unnecessary bloodshed. Waverly was silent, watching the children. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its official detachment. Mrs. Sinclair, I was sent here expecting to find a well-meaning failure. Territorial politicians believe you're wasting resources on a romantic notion that will collapse the moment real pressure is applied. They sent me to document that failure and recommend terminating your funding. Julia's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. And what will you report? That they're wrong, Waverly said simply, turning to face her. What you've built here, it's remarkable. These children aren't just learning to read and write. They're learning to see each other as human beings first, as potential allies rather than inevitable enemies. In a territory that's seen decades of violence, that may be the most important education anyone could receive. Relief flooded through Julia, so suddenly she had to grip the courtyard rail to steady herself. Then you'll recommend continued funding. I'll recommend increased funding, Waverly corrected. And I'll push for your model to be replicated in other territorial schools. What you're doing here should be the standard, not the exception. After Waverly left, Julia walked to the workshop where Aida supervised a dozen apprentices. The space had grown to include silversmithing, pottery, basket weaving, and leatherwork. Products from this workshop now sold throughout the territory and as far east as St. Louis, bearing tags that identified them as Sinclair Chiricahua Cooperative Work. "Good news?" Aida asked, reading Julia's expression. "The best," Julia confirmed. "Full continued funding. Possibly expansion." Aida smiled, a rare expression that transformed her usually stern face. "Kosaya will want to hear this. He's at the ranch with the new horses." The ranch was another expansion, 40 acres purchased with cooperative profits, where Apache men trained cavalry mounts using traditional horse handling methods that produced better results than standard military breaking techniques. It had become another bridge, another way for cultures to exchange knowledge and build mutual respect. Julia borrowed a horse from the stable and rode out to the ranch, following familiar trails through country that had seemed so hostile 2 years ago, but now felt almost welcoming. She found Kasai in the largest corral working with a young stallion. His movements patient and assured, he'd changed in 2 years, grown into authority that went beyond his war chief status. He was now officially recognized by the territorial government as a liaison between Apache communities and American authorities. His testimony had led to the removal of 3 corrupt reservation agents and the implementation of new oversight procedures. "Julia," he called, spotting her approach. He handed the stallion's lead to an apprentice and walked to meet her. "I can see from your face that the inspection went well." "Better than well," Julia said, dismounting. "Waverly wants to use our school as a model for the entire territory." Kasai's smile was warm, genuine, the expression of someone who'd learned to celebrate victories no matter how hard won. "Then we should celebrate, properly tonight, with everyone who helped build this." That evening, the compound filled with people. Teachers and craftspeople, Apache families and white settlers who'd become invested in the cooperative's success. Nanton had arranged for food from the town's best restaurants, while Aida had prepared traditional Apache dishes. The result was a feast that embodied everything they'd built, cultures blending rather than competing. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, as music started, a mix of Apache drums and Spanish guitar and American fiddle, Julia found herself standing slightly apart, watching, marveling at how far they'd all come. Kasai appeared beside her, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "Remembering?" he asked. The word that had become their shorthand for reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "Always," Julia replied, "remembering a canyon filled with death. Remembering being terrified and exhausted and certain I'd made the worst mistake of my life. And now," Kasai prompted. "Now I can't imagine any other choice," Julia said. "Can't imagine the person I'd be if I'd walked away. Can't imagine life without this work, without this family we've built." Kasai was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "Julia, there is something I have wanted to discuss with you. Something personal rather than professional." Julia's heart quickened, sensing the weight behind his words. "What is it?" "In Apache culture, when a man wishes to court a woman, to build a life with her, he approaches with gifts and intentions made clear," Kasai said, his usual confidence faltering slightly. "But you are not Apache, and I am uncertain what customs govern such things in your world." Julia turned to face him fully, seeing vulnerability in his expression that he rarely showed. "Are you asking to court me, Kasai?" "I am asking if you would consider it," he replied. "I know the complications, the way some will judge, the difficulties we would face, but I also know that in 2 years I have found no one whose mind I respect more, whose courage I admire more, whose presence makes me want to be better than I am." Julia felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. "In my world," she said softly, "when a man wishes to court a woman, he asks her directly. And she answers from her heart. Then I ask directly, Kasai said. Taking her hand, Julia Sinclair, will you allow me to court you? To see if what we have built as partners could become something more. Yes, Julia said, the words simple but weighted with 2 years of growing affection. Of admiration that had deepened into something neither of them had initially recognized. Yes, I will. Kasai's smile was brilliant, unguarded. He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that blended Apache respect with American courtesy. Around them the celebration continued. Their friends and family too absorbed in music and food to notice this quiet moment that changed everything. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the compound settled into peaceful silence, Julia stood on the roof of the school building looking out over Tucson. The town sprawled across the valley, lamplight flickering in hundreds of windows, each one representing a life, a story, a series of choices that had led to this moment. She thought about Thomas, about the woman she'd been in Santa Fe, desperate and directionless, thought about the canyon where she'd found Kasai bleeding, about every decision that had followed. To help rather than abandon, to fight rather than surrender, to build rather than simply survive. No regrets. Aida's voice came from behind her. The other woman had climbed up silently, settling beside Julia with the ease of long friendship. None, Julia confirmed. I regret that it took my brother almost dying for us to find you, Aida said with characteristic bluntness. But I do not regret what we have built together. You have given Apache children something precious. The ability to succeed in the American world without losing their Apache souls. That is a rare gift. We built it together, Julia corrected. I just provided one piece, the piece that connected everything else, Aida replied. Before you, we had traditions but no bridge to the future. You showed us how to honor the past while embracing change. That matters more than you perhaps understand. They sat in silence for a while. Two women from vastly different worlds who'd become sisters through shared purpose. Finally, Aida spoke again. Kasai asked you. It wasn't a question, Julia smiled. How did you know? I am his sister. I know when he is gathering courage for something difficult, Aida said. And I have watched the way he looks at you. The way you look at him, it was only a matter of time. Does it bother you? Julia asked. The complications it will create. Complications already exist, Aida said pragmatically. What is one more besides? You have proven you do not fear difficult paths. And my brother deserves happiness. If he has found it with you, I will not stand in the way. Julia felt warmth flood through her. The acceptance meaning more than she could express. Thank you. Thank me by continuing what you do, Aida replied. Teach our children, build our businesses, help us survive in this world that tries so hard to erase us. That is thanks enough. As spring turned to summer, the compound continued to grow. Another classroom was added, the workshop expanded. New partnerships formed with merchants and reservation communities throughout the territory. Julia and Kasai's courtship became public knowledge, drawing exactly the criticism they'd expected from those who saw cultural boundaries as immutable, but also drawing support from surprising quarters. Captain Morrison publicly endorsed the match, as did several prominent Tucson merchants who'd prospered through cooperative trade. On a morning 1 year later, Julia stood in a dress that blended white lace with Apache beadwork. Kasai beside her in traditional warrior dress decorated with silver. And they married in a ceremony that honored both their cultures, witnessed by a crowd that included Apache elders and cavalry officers, Mexican families and white settlers, territorial officials and reservation residents. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear because two people chose to love across cultural lines. But it was progress, visible and undeniable. Proof that different worlds could not just coexist but intertwine. And when Julia lay beside her husband that night, In the home they'd built together, overlooking the school and workshops and everything they'd created. She thought about the canyon one last time. About the choice that had seemed so simple in the moment, but had rippled outward to touch hundreds of lives. One decision, to stop rather than pass by, to help rather than ignore. To choose compassion over convenience. That choice had saved 2 lives, had toppled corruption. Had built bridges and schools and businesses. Had created family from strangers and hope from desperation. Julia Sinclair Kasai, teacher and businesswoman and wife and friend, closed her eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. New opportunities to choose courage over comfort. New chances to build rather than destroy, and she welcomed it all. Because she'd learned the truth that changes everything. That mercy isn't weakness but strength. That one person's choice can reshape the world. That the greatest adventures begin not with grand plans, but with simple moments where you decide who you want to be. She decided in a canyon filled with blood and death and dying hope. And that decision had given her everything. A purpose, a family, a love she'd never imagined. A life worth living, one woman, one warrior. One impossible night that led to all of this, and as sleep claimed her, Julia smiled. Grateful beyond measure that she'd stopped, that she'd looked, that she'd helped, because sometimes salvation comes from the simplest choice and changes everything forever.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.